Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine, if you will, those last brutal months of World War II in Italy.
Yeah.
It's not just about armies clashing on the front lines.
No, not at all. Behind those lines, particularly where Germany still held occupied territory, there was this other horrific conflict happening.
A war against civilians. It's
Mhm.
this really intense period full of, big military plans, but also these terrible localized acts of violence.
That contrast is precisely what we're digging into today. You've got the Allied High Command planning Operation Grapeshot, this final offensive, logistics, strategy, massive troop movements.
Hmm.
And at the very same time, German forces are carrying out these widespread atrocities against Italian civilians.
Mm.
Two sides of the same coin, really.
Exactly. So we're going to unpack the material you've shared to get a grip on this. First, looking closely at the massacres by German forces during the occupation.
Right.
And then we'll examine that final Allied military push, Operation Grapeshot, which, ultimately ended the war there. Our mission is to see what happened in both spheres and how they actually connect.
Okay, let's start with that civilian experience. It's incredibly tough from the Italian armistice in September 43 onwards, right up to liberation in 45. The cost was just enormous.
Enormous is definitely the word. I mean, the figures suggest maybe up to 70,000 Italian lives
Right.
lost overall because of the occupation.
Yeah.
And within that, over 10,000 people were civilians.
Yeah.
Just murdered
Yeah.
in massacres, mass executions.
It's a shocking number, and it really underscores Germany's commemorative responsibility, even today, to those victims, those communities.
Absolutely.
And, Italian historians, they call this la guerra ai civili, the war against civilians. It wasn't random violence. It points to something more systematic, more organized, sadly.
And the trigger point, or a key turning point anyway, was that Italian armistice on September 8th, 1943.
Right. That changed the whole dynamic.
Suddenly, with the Allies advancing from the south and Italian partisan resistance growing, especially in those mountainous areas like the Apennines.
Yeah, the Apennines became crucial.
Ordinary towns and villages became battlegrounds, even if they were miles from the official front line.
Exactly. And German forces, when faced with sabotage or partisan attacks, often reacted with these incredibly harsh reprisals.
But not always against the partisans themselves.
That's the chilling part. Often, no. They lashed out at the civilian population. They killed women, children, old people, priests, alongside the men. Just devastating collective punishment.
And these massacres happened all over occupied Italy, didn't they? We hear names like the Fosse Ardeatine Caves near Rome,
A particularly infamous one.
Sottana di Stazzema, Monte Sole, those
Yeah.
villages like Sorpiano, San Martino di Capra.
Monte Sole was horrific. And Vinca, too, you mentioned the source gave a specific number there. 162 people killed in August 44.
Just terrible. And the list goes on, doesn't it? Caiazzo, Cavriglia, Civitella, Podule di Fucecchio.
It really does. Civarolo, Chivago, San Polo. It shows how widespread this tactic, this brutality became.
So who were the perpetrators? It wasn't just one group, right?
No, that's important. It involved different branches. The SS, of course, often comes to mind.
Yes.
But also units from the regular army, the Wehrmacht, were involved in many of these massacres. And the SD, the security service, played its part too.
So tracing responsibility means looking at specific commanders and units, like Albert Kesselring, the overall commander. He was implicated in the Fosse Ardeatine killings, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Tried afterwards.
He was. And others, like Gerhard Sommer, linked to Sant'Anna di Stazzema, though convicted much later in absentia.
And specific units are named to the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Reichsfuhrer SS.
Very notorious. But also Wehrmacht units, like the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, parachute troops, or the Hermann Göring Panzer Division.
Right, so it wasn't confined to just the SS.
No, it was broader than that. It involved various elements of the German military and security machine operating in Italy.
And after the war, you mentioned that for the victims, the families, it was incredibly hard to find out who was actually responsible.
Extremely difficult. Getting reliable information, names, units, it was often impossible for years. And that lack of clarity, well, sometimes led to mistaken ideas or distortions about what happened and who did it.
And at the same time, back in Germany, a different story was taking hold.
Yes, particularly among veterans. This myth grew up about the Wehrmacht having fought a clean war in Italy, denying or downplaying these atrocities. A stark contrast to the reality on the ground.
This lack of clear information, the absence of German perpetrators in the public story in Italy, that led to this concept of memoria divisa, divided memory.
Exactly, a contested, fragmented memory. Because if you don't know who specifically committed the crime, Where does the anger go? Sometimes, tragically, it could get turned inwards or create divisions within Italian communities themselves.
Which makes the work of historians trying to piece together the perpetrator side so important.
Absolutely vital. Understanding their backgrounds, the situations they were in, their mindsets, how they justified these actions. It's about building a realistic picture.
Using all sorts of sources, I imagine. Military records, court files.
Personal diaries, letters, photos, memoirs. Trying to understand the context, the decision-making space, the mentalities that allowed these things to happen.
Okay, so that's the grim reality of the occupation war. Now let's pivot to the other major story. The military campaign to end it all, Operation Grapeshot.
Right. The Allied Spring Offensive of 1945. They'd broken through the Gothic Line defenses late in 44.
But got bogged down by winter.
Yeah, couldn't push into the Po Valley properly before the weather closed in. So Spring 45 was set for the final decisive push.
And the forces involved. On the Allied side, it was the 15th Army Group. Mark Clark in command.
That's right, comprising the British 8th Army, now under Richard McCreary,
Right.
and the U.S. 5th Army, led by Lucian Truscott.
Facing the German Army Group C, initially von Wiedinghoff commanding them.
Correct. And in terms of numbers, the Allies had a significant advantage, something like 1.3 million ration strength, maybe 900,000 fighting troops.
Compared to the Axis.
Maybe around 585,000 total, closer to 400,000 actual combatants, Germans, and troops of Mussolini's Italian Social Republic.
So what was the Allied plan? What was Clark aiming for?
The main goal was clear. Trap and destroy the bulk of German forces south of the Po River. Then force crossings over the Po and capture key cities, particularly Verona, to cut off escape routes.
And it was planned in phases.
Yes, Phase 1. The British 8th Army attacks first, in the east. They had to cross two rivers, the Senio and the Santerno. Tough obstacle.
All its banks, right? Almost like fortress wall.
Exactly. They aimed for a two-pronged advance. One push up the Adriatic coast, Route 16, towards the Argenta Gap, a key bottleneck. The other push inland towards Budrio.
Okay. Then the 5th Army joins in.
Yes, a few days later, their main job was to punch north, aiming towards Bologna, break into the Po Valley Plain.
And Phase 2, exploiting the breakthrough.
Right. 8th Army drives northwest towards Ferrara and Bondeno, trying to block German retreat routes across the Po. 5th Army pushes past Bologna, heads north to link up with the 8th Army near Bondeno, essentially closing a pocket.
Trapping the Germans south of the river.
That was the idea. And also a secondary push for the 5th Army towards Ostiglia, another Po crossing point leading towards Verona.
And Phase 3.
Get across the Po in force, establish bridgeheads, and then exploit northwards to finish the campaign. They also planned some diversions, like attacks around Lake Comacchio, Operation Roast, to distract the Germans.
Okay, so how did it actually unfold? When did it kick off?
The main 8th Army assault started on April 9th. It began with a massive aerial and artillery bombardment. Heavy bombers, fighter bombers, huge amounts of artillery fire.
Goffing them up.
Try to, yes. Crossing the Senio was brutal, just as expected. Those high flood banks were heavily defended.
You mentioned specialized tanks.
Yeah, units like the 8th Indian and 2nd New Zealand Divisions used things like Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks to help clear the defenses. It was tough fighting, but they got across.
And on to the Santerno.
Pretty quickly, yeah. By April 11th or 12th, they had bridgeheads over the Santerno too. Then units like the British 78th Division started pushing hard towards Argenta.
And then amphibious attack.
Right. The British 56th Division launched an attack across flooded land on the eastern flank of the Argenta Gap, trying to outflank the defenders there.
So the pressure was building. When did the 5th Army attack?
They launched their main assault on April 14th after their own intense bombardment. 4 corps on the left, including the 10th Mountain Division, making its big combat debut.
Ah, the mountain troops.
And 2 corps in the center, pushing north along different routes towards Bologna.
And the Germans, how did they react?
They fought hard, very determined defense in places. But the sheer weight of Allied firepower, especially air power, and the fact that the Germans just didn't have the reserves to plug the gaps, it started to tell.
Breakthroughs started happening.
Yes. The Argenta Gap defense finally crumbled around April 19th. That was key. It let the British 6th Armored Division break out and race northwest towards Bondeno.
To link up with the Americans.
Exactly. The 5th Army was also pushing hard. The link-up happened, sealing off large parts of the German forces.
And the city started to fall. Bologna.
Bologna was entered on April 21st. Interestingly, Polish troops fighting with the 8th Army and Italian troops from the Cremona Combat Group got there first, just ahead of the U.S. forces.
And elsewhere. Partisans were active too, right?
Hugely important. Partisans liberated Parma and Reggio Emilia on April 24th. Crucially, they liberated Milan and Turin on April 25th before the main Allied columns arrived. They played a massive role across the north.
Wow. So the Allied advance accelerated.
Absolutely. The 10th Mountain Division reached the Po River on April 22nd, crossed it the next day. They entered Verona on April 26th. Other Allied units were crossing the Po all along the line by April 25th.
Cutting off escape routes became the priority then.
Yes. Forces like the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, 1st Armored Division pushed west along the main Route 9 towards Piacenza and the north across the Po to block the Alpine passes.
And those pockets of resistance, you mentioned the Brazilians.
Yeah, near Fornovo, south of Parma, they surrounded a large concentration of German and Italian RSI troops. Took something like 13,500 prisoners around April 28th. It was collapsing fast for the Axis.
Even Padua partisans had already secured the garrison there before the Allies arrived.
Yeah, it's right. The end came very swiftly then.
The surrender process. Were there talks happening behind the scenes?
There were secret negotiations, yes. Operation Crossword in Switzerland. But the formal, unconditional surrender of all Axis forces in Italy was signed at the Allied headquarters in Caserta on April 29th.
Effective when?
Effective May 2nd. There was a bit of confusion with command changes on the German side, but it went through.
And the Italian Social Republic forces.
Marshal Graziani announced their unconditional surrender, too, on May 1st. It was effectively over.
And the cost of this final push? Casualties.
The numbers cited suggest around 16,000 Allied casualties killed, wounded, missing during that final offensive from early April.
And for the Axis.
Estimates are around 30,000 to 32,000 casualties, plus vast numbers of prisoners taken in those final days.
So pulling it all together,
Mm-hmm.
what does it all mean? How do these two stories, the massacres, the occupation's brutality, and this massive final military campaign, how do they fit?
Well, they're completely intertwined, aren't they? Operation Grapeshot, the military campaign, is what physically defeated the German army in Italy.
Right.
And by doing so, it ended the occupation. And therefore, it ended the specific conditions under which that horrific war against civilians, La Guerra ai Civili, was taking place. The military victory stopped the killing.
But the nature of the two stories is so different.
Totally. The military story is often told in terms of strategy, breakthroughs, liberation. It's a narrative of forward movement, ultimately victory. The story of the massacres it's about the violence behind the lines. It's about the lived experience of occupation, the specific cruelty, the individual acts of perpetrators, the suffering of victims in these small towns and villages.
So for you, the listener, understanding this period means holding both narratives in mind. You can't really grasp it without seeing both the big picture military stuff and the devastating impact on the ground, on ordinary people.
Exactly. The Grapeshot Offensive brought liberation, but the memory of what people were being liberated from, that brutality, those specific crimes, that story, and the struggle for accountability, the memoria divisa we talked about, is just as crucial.
It highlights the complexity, doesn't it? The large-scale maneuvers versus the individual responsibility for atrocities.
Absolutely. It shows war isn't just one thing. It's strategy and suffering, liberation and loss, all happening at once.
So we've journeyed through both the grim reality of the massacres during the German occupation and the details of the final Allied offensive that brought the war in Italy to its conclusion. Two vital connected pieces of the same history.
And maybe a final thought for you to reflect on. How does digging into the details of individual perpetrators, their backgrounds, their justifications, their specific actions in these massacres, how does that change or add to the more common narrative focused just on the military victory and liberation? What does looking closely at both the big history of the armies and the small history of individual crimes tell us about war itself, about how we remember it, and about the long, often difficult path towards accountability? Something to keep thinking about.